thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here with Alejandro. My name's David Shukman. I'm a journalist, probably one of the few journalists in the room. Not everybody likes journalists, so I'm going to keep my distance over here in case I'm a bit unpopular. What we're going to do is explore Alejandro's fascinating work, drilling into some of the great detail of some of the broad topics that came up in this morning's excellent sessions. But before we get into that, there's something I'd like to do. I find if I'm hearing people address me from a podium, or if you're hearing an interview or a discussion, I'm quite keen to know their backstory. Who is this person? What makes them tick? How did they get to do what they're doing? And I'm going to ask Alejandro to tell us a little bit about how he got into his work in a second. But I thought I might just share with you my own journey, very, very briefly, don't worry, because I began my journalistic career in Northern Ireland in the 1980s. I was reporting on bombs, bullets, and riots. It was a very steep learning curve for a young reporter. You had to learn a lot about how to stay safe. You also had to learn to be very suspicious of what people were telling you, particularly politicians. There's this word we have in England about spin, propaganda, how people are putting a positive gloss on something. And I really learnt to carry that with me into my later career. Many steps down the track, I then found myself about 13 years ago reporting on environmental and scientific issues. And that cynicism from the streets of Northern Ireland stuck with me, in that I was quite cynical about environmental claims that you hear from NGOs. We're all going to fry next Tuesday or drown on Wednesday. I'd heard till I was a bit bored, to be honest, about save the rainforest. So I thought what I could do for myself and as a service to audiences was just to go around some of these locations and report for myself on what I was finding out. And it was very, very educational. There was I, the cynic, thinking a lot of this environmental stuff surely is exaggerated. And on my first trip to the Arctic, to the Greenland ice sheet, helicopter dropped us on the mile-thick ice sheet, and I was very struck that the surface was dirty. It was black, and it was soot. Particles of soot carried from the great power stations of Europe, China, and North America had made their way up to the Arctic. And I thought, oh, maybe we can have an impact on our planet. Then I went to the Amazon rainforest, and we were out with the environmental police, 6 of them, covering an area the size of Texas, no helicopter, 1 jeep, and we stumbled across some guys illegally chopping down trees. The sap was still dripping from the trees in an area that was meant to be completely untouched. And I thought, okay, maybe there is something about this deforestation we've heard so much about over the years. And then perhaps most striking of all for me was to go to a little tiny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Midway Atoll. Gorgeous coral atoll. It's home to some very precious wildlife, some fantastic albatrosses. But they are dying in their thousands because they eat bits of plastic waste, toothbrushes, little hotel shampoo bottles, all the stuff that ends up in the ocean and drifts around and lands on this little island, which you would think would be pristine and immune from the travails of modern life. But there, mankind's impact is also being felt. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, is that you have to see it to convince yourself that there's something really going on. That doesn't mean that every environmental claim is necessarily justified, but it just means that, in my view, when the scientists tell us something, it's really worth listening. So let's turn the corner to you. That's where I'm coming from. So I'm sitting in this seat with someone who's an expert, a consultant in sustainability. I've become convinced that there's a great deal going on in the planet that we should be concerned about. Alejandro, what was it for you that, if you like, tipped you into getting into this work? What motivated you? Because you're Argentine, you were brought up in Argentina. What was going on there that, if you like, convinced you that you really needed to think hard about this whole topic?
Well, thank you. David, let me say, for me, the key aha moment was working with big companies in Argentina and realizing that it is impossible for companies to plan to grow in a sustained way in societies that are not successful.
And in fact, quite troubled.
Yes, so you can't be successful in business in an unsuccessful society. And I think in many ways, Argentina, for all of you who are experienced in those markets, really represents, I think, the tsunami of pressures that companies are facing in terms of social, environmental, and governance. If you think about the last 5 years, you've seen soybeans having an export tax of over 35%. You've seen a law passed in parliament that restricts foreign ownership of land. You've seen the deforestation frontier moving aggressively and creating conflicts with communities in ways that are pretty much beyond the control of multinationals, where there's collusion with local law enforcement agencies and so on. And you've seen the exponential growth of climate change to the point that systemic droughts have decimated wheat harvests. So I think that really, for me, working with business leaders in those contexts, where companies are having to make public commitments, but are enormously threatened by the forces that are totally outside their control, really shaped my sense of purpose as well.
When we were talking earlier, Alejandro and I, this phrase, the perfect storm, came up. And I first heard it in connection with the former British government chief scientist, Sir John Bedingfield, who talked about a perfect storm of many of the things we've been discussing this morning: population growth, climate change, water scarcity, popular pressures, public pressures. I mean, you've witnessed and experienced some of that yourself.
Well, I think the bottom line for me is that sustainability pressures are in many ways driving popular demands that really fuel resource nationalism. And this is really the fundamental risk that companies are facing today. I've lived for the last 13 years in London. I've worked all around the world, in Russia, in Indonesia, in India, in China, East Africa, back to Brazil many times. And I think it's been again and again really seeing that what is happening inside companies in terms of their sustainability thinking, greater efficiency of footprints, and a number of other very, very necessary things, is in many ways dwarfed by the magnitude of pressures that companies are facing from the outside. And I think I have a presentation that is really informed by this insight. And for me, the key question is, what do you do practically in terms of the enormous challenges that you're facing today, and in order to, as a company, be able to drive that systemic change while keeping very aligned with obviously with commercial objectives.
And just to pick up on something that I think we were both struck by that Sonny said this morning, this idea that in the last century there were conflicts over oil. This century we may see conflicts over land and food. And I'm going to say, as someone who used to report on conflicts and thought I was moving on beyond that, it was quite depressing to hear that kind of projection, that what we're talking about is serious enough for someone like a business leader, like Sonny, to contemplate a conflict over these issues. How does that strike you?
I think that resonates a lot. And what you're seeing today in terms of this particular industry and the enormous competitive pressures that exist and repositioning of different countries and their public resources, you see a competition for taking positions in deep sea ports. You're seeing positions to try to control infrastructure. But ultimately, there's a limited amount of land that has national sovereignty boundaries. And I think that in many ways is a big constraining pressure factor. And then there's one last thing, perhaps before we jump right into it. And I would say, when I published the first Earth Security Index 3 years ago, we talked about a case where in 2010, Russia had a big drought that really decimated the wheat harvest. Now, one of the biggest buyers of Russian wheat was Egypt. And Egypt therefore had to scramble into the market to replenish its reserves, and it did that at a high international price, right? That had a knock-on effect into domestic prices. And that is attributed as one of the key factors driving the Arab Spring, right? And so the fact that a drought, climate change in one market that drives the political decision of restrict exports has a knock-on effect in other countries that has enormous political consequences, to me really speaks of that world of interdependencies that Sunny was talking about this morning, and that for companies has enormous risks, I would say today, in terms of how they operate in a market and how they think about their long-term operation over, let's say, a 20 or 30 year time window.
So we're talking about a potentially ugly landscape, aren't we? This is the reality of it, isn't it? That you know, the stakes are high. You mentioned Egypt. There was a piece of research just recently about Syria. Prolonged drought in Syria drove 1 million people off the land into the cities, causing instability in the cities, which may conceivably have added to the pressures that indirectly or directly led to the civil war. I think you've mentioned the presentation you've got. I think we should move on to that. So what fascinates me, I've had a sneak preview of what Alejandro is going to get into. I might just summarize it in one sentence. What I get out of it is that he has very cleverly pulled together every conceivable factor that might affect a business operating in a certain country, when so often, whether it's NGOs or scientific specialists, they look at a particular angle, whether it's water or climate, or the lawyers looking at land issues, or the human rights people looking at labor issues. And you've pulled it all together. So look, the floor is yours for the next, I think, 20, 25 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions afterwards. So you want to stand? How do you want to do this?
I think I'll just stand and move around.
Great. All right.
Thank you very much. Well, let me just jump straight to it. Yeah, as David was saying, I've spent the last 5 years as I founded the Earth Security Group building quite a unique and novel tool that I've called the Earth Security Index. And what this does for a country is bring together official country data across a variety of, in this case, 24 dimensions that have really the potential to impact a company's operation, whether it's because they can drive an increase in operational costs, whether, as let's say, water pollution, whether they are driving the social license to operate, where a company is losing reputation, is losing relationships with local stakeholders, as is the case of land tenure, whether also there are opportunities to innovate. But most important, my core concern is for companies to become more aware of what are the fundamental pressures that are shaping their operating context. Yeah. So what you see here is across 4 dimensions. Maybe you don't have to read the detail, but essentially we're looking at environmental, social governance, and energy as a separate, let's say, more industrial issue. In energy, we look at the carbon intensity of electricity in that country. We look at access to energy. We look at electricity blackouts as affecting operations and manufacturing facilities. In environmental issues, we look at land degradation. We look at deforestation, water scarcity, water pollution, weather extremes. In social, we look at poverty, demographic growth, youth unemployment, skills gap, gender inequality. And in governance, we look at corruption, we look at inflation, we look at the sustainability of the debt, and the effectiveness of a government to actually implement the laws it has. When you bring all of that together, and we know that all these things are important in and of themselves, but when they create a picture, it really creates a bit of an oracle. It's not about the data. The data is published by international institutions. It's safe data in some ways. It's country-level data. But what is most important is the mindset. It's just being able to see the convergence of pressures. Right? Now, we use this tool, I would say, predominantly to work with individual companies in looking at what is their readiness to respond to the pressures in their context. But I would like to talk about today a piece of work that we've done in partnership with the Swiss government, where they've asked us to, or they've enabled us to generate a snapshot that is public and that is intended for the global sector, in this case of food and agriculture. We've covered other sectors as well. And I'm delighted to make this available to the Global Agri-Business Alliance, let's say, as an input, hopefully to all the members to use. Yeah? Now, this is what we've done. Right? We've taken the 25 biggest multinational companies that are publicly listed in the food and agriculture sector. On the right, yeah, you can see there UK companies, US companies, French, Mexican, Chinese, Indian, Swiss, and so on. Right? We've then said which are the main developing countries or emerging markets where these companies have most of their fixed assets invested in. And we've combined that with, let's say, key sourcing countries. And the result is a list of countries that is really fundamental to the sustained growth of these companies over the next 5 to 10 years. Right? And this is the interesting thing. We then applied the index to the bunch to all of these countries together. And this is what we found. So in my mind, this is really, for any one of you, this is really the representation of what you can expect in the global operating context of your company, taking let's say, the primary 15, 16, 17 countries that are very likely in your portfolio. Yeah? And what do we see? First of all, the visual shows the bigger the wedge, the more pressure there is. It's a risk visual. Yeah? We see deforestation, we see land degradation and loss of ecosystem services, we see water pollution, impact of weather extremes, we see food insecurity, land tenure insecurity, and high levels of corruption. What does it mean for a company that these pressures are happening simultaneously in its operating context? Yeah? Then we've taken 3 of the big high-growth regions for the sector, and we've looked at what are the main countries in those regions that are really driving the growth of the sector over the next 10 years. And you see a mosaic of realities. There isn't one reality. They're local realities, they're regional realities. Yeah? And when we overlay this with an analysis of what is actually happening with these companies, what are the pressures they're exposed to, you really begin to find unique combinations of issues that in many ways are totally beyond the control of individual companies. And so, what is the corporate collaboration challenge? This, to me, is fundamental. There is no other way for companies to face the risks that they're facing today, where they're being forced to make commitments, and we'll go into that in a second, without really partnering up with industry peers, partnering up in a geographical scope, at the landscape level, partnering up with governments, partnering up with civil society in a very strategic way. Yeah? So let me focus on 3 core issues where I think companies are going to see increasing trouble. Why? Because they're being asked to make very important commitments today, to take a public stance of issues that are very, very significant to the societies where they operate, but where these pressures are going to most likely derail those commitments. Yeah? And then let's explore practically what companies can do in order to be prepared to face these sorts of issues. The first issue is competition for water. Any of you that is operating in India today knows that India is heading inexorably to a major water crisis. Yeah? The water tables are being depleted, there's very poor regulation, electricity subsidies are creating perverse incentives, there's all sorts of issues. But the reality is that it's not just water in and of itself, it is the combination with land degradation, with water pollution, with climate change, and all these things are interconnected, and they have an impact on food security and on water scarcity. And so we see many of the companies making very important commitments that are necessary, that relate to the efficiency of their water use. And this is fundamental. Efficiency measures need to be in place. But at the same time, efficiency alone is not enough, right? In this brief that we've done with the Swiss government, we mentioned one case, which is ITC in India, and a very, very successful program, which is basically moving from the company and its particular supply chains to the watershed level. The company needs to understand what is happening in this catchment area on which its own water depends, right? What is happening? You have other companies using the water, you have other industries using the water. You have coal fire stations that are very water intensive. There's enormous competition between energy and agriculture for the same water. And there's an enormous need to engage with governments and helping governments improve the management of water resources. There's no other way. Companies need to engage with the governments. They need to work together. And the ITC example actually shows an enormously successful case of collaboration at scale with let's say, municipal governments, with multi-stakeholder, village-level associations that are responsible. It's a whole infrastructure that we've described that shows a way forward. It is possible, but requires collaboration. Second issue, land conflicts. Now, companies have been forced in many ways to take commitments. Many companies have made commitments to zero land grabs in their value chains. But this is very, very difficult to monitor. So in many cases, this is going to be perhaps impossible to enforce. And the exposure of companies remain, even though they may be making a policy at the headquarters level that has to do with really trying to enforce zero land grabs. And so there's a case of Gabon that we've actually looked at Olam's investment because we've looked around and this by coincidence, but this is really the case that is most advanced in any other company that we've seen, where in the case of Gabon, you see it's not just land tenure issues, there's enormous food insecurity. Gabon is very dependent on food imports. Let's say its food production system is very, very weak. And then you have obviously rule of law questions and government capacity. So it takes years for a community to formalize their land titles. Almost 100% of people don't have a formal title to the land. It's all customary, right? But this case, to me, was very important. It really showed the way forward, that the action is not just to say we're going to declare a zero land grab tolerance policy. We're seeing the case of a company taking a bolder step and saying we are going to, as part of a production model, help the communities to formalize their land titles. This is unprecedented in many ways. And I'm not saying that because we are at an Olam-sponsored event. I mean, we published this 6 months ago. Yeah? But this is a way to go. But now this required a partnership with the government that helps the government build capacity, and the results are incredible. It's over 3,000 land titles acquired. It takes 3 or 4 years, and this was achieved in, 3 months? Something like that. I mean, it's incredible. Now, for companies that are dealing with the challenge of land grabs, and this is not just in Africa, it's also happening in South America, it's happening in Asia, then there is a need to shift the mentality and go from a defensive position to one that is transformative. And that transformation requires partnership. It requires building governance capacity. And then the third issue is forests. And we've seen enormous commitments in New York last year or 2 years ago, zero deforestation in the supply chains. It was mentioned today as well. We've looked at the soybean production hub in South America, where production is increasingly integrated across borders in Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, based on competitive advantages of the 3 countries, logistics, storage, crushing, and so on. And big players, Cargill and others, dominating production across the frontiers and looking at sort of a production hub. Yeah? I mentioned Cargill because we launched this more than a year ago with Cargill Brazil, convening all of their clients to really start thinking about how do we think about the complexity now that we've made the commitment. And one of the things that we recommended was, well, when you look at this from the integrated perspective, you actually see that Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina share some commonalities. There is deforestation that's going on. There's very weak land tenure. There is challenges with the rule of law, but there's also challenges with the effectiveness of governments to implement the laws that they have. In the case of Argentina and Paraguay, they have forest laws, but they're not implemented very well. Yeah? And what we said is, well, in Brazil, you're required to publish or to share your satellite information. This is not the case in Argentina and Paraguay, right? And this is one case for companies to try to go one step beyond and share their information and build partnerships with civil society with the likes of WRI and others that already have enormous capabilities and platforms to monitor forest governance and take a position to strengthen the governance of forests in the countries where you operate. Because unless you do that, then there's an enormous reputation risk for the commitments that you've had to take. Right? And you begin to see a pattern, right? Partner to strengthen forest governance. You begin to see a pattern. Water, land and food, forest, biodiversity. The pattern is the companies are facing enormous challenges, and there's one way to address these challenges that has to do with cooperation and has to do with transboundary cooperation and transsectorial cooperation. Now, I've put the Zero Hunger SDG here because it's really, in many ways, the topic of our discussion. We've developed another framework that allows us to look at the SDGs for business and look at them not just from the perspective of how we as a company contribute to the SDGs, but actually what the SDGs can do for you. Because when we've looked at the targets, 169, and we've simplified them so a company can understand what they mean, because it's very convoluted language. It's been the result of very lengthy political negotiations. Yeah? You look at each of the targets, and you begin to discover that many of these issues, they really have an impact on the costs that a company is incurring in. Big bottling plants, looking at water pollution, is an enormous increasing cost of water treatment. You're looking at land and so on and so forth. But then when we've run this process through these examples, what we find is intuitive and is in many ways something we've talked about before. Many of these problems are multifaceted and touch on very specific SDGs. But what I find interesting is that one SDG that keeps coming up has to do with governance. It has to do with institutions. It has to do with a policy environment. And my view is that the policy environment and governance is fundamental to a well-functioning society, and therefore fundamental to the risk exposure that large companies are facing today as they're distributed around the world and facing a mosaic of challenges that are different in different places. But what is constant is that companies need to adopt a position that helps strengthen the policy environment, that helps strengthen law implementation, helps strengthen the capacity of bureaucracies to deal with land titles, and so on and so forth. Right? And to do that, you need the partnerships with the NGOs, you need the partnerships with the governments. And these are two very different languages that need to be mediated. So really come to the end. Yes, for me, there's three key messages. The first is around the importance of context. The context is becoming more volatile. It's becoming volatile not because we don't understand the individual issues, but because these issues are happening at the same time. Food insecurity is happening at the same time as high inflation, and happening at the same time as water scarcity, and happening at the same time as poverty. And these things are self-reinforcing. And it requires a new logic of seeing the issues, and it requires a new logic of acting. And I think the first recommendation or key message for me is that companies need to get the sustainability plans, need to get their corporate strategy growth plans, and tested vis-a-vis what is actually happening in particular markets, in particular countries, to understand where are the gaps, how ready am I? Now, the second is, there's been a lot of discussion of smallholders, and clearly the livelihoods dimension, addressing the inequality, is to me one of the fundamental also building blocks of this agenda. And what we see is not poverty or environment. That distinction doesn't exist anymore. Yeah? You're seeing growing social inequality at the same time as in unequal access to resources, at the same time as those resources are becoming more scarce. I mean, they're becoming more depleted. Right? And in many, I think there needs to be a discussion on production models. The production models need to be more relational. That it's about outgrower schemes. It's about empowering and co-producing with communities and really lifting people out of poverty in a way that benefits supply chains, but with a very strong environmental component. So it's really moving on beyond that either or. And then the third is really, and we've seen it in our experience in also working with governments, is governments need to be part of the equation. This is, I think, is an interesting angle for the Global Alliance. There's enormous interest of governments, both host governments as well as let's say, government development partners, to partner with business. And there's a lot of activity going on, and you probably have all sorts of pilot projects with agencies and with local governments and so on. Now, the question is, what are the strategic areas where companies and governments need to partner on? And some of the issues that I've addressed today that are really rooted in an understanding of these are the real pressures that are happening. These wedges, they're not the 2020, 2050, 2060. They're 2014. Yeah? And so in many ways, I think this is hopefully this is also an input, both to the Alliance, but also to a new way of thinking about pressures, about transcending boundaries of silos, and to really thinking and acting in a more integrated way. So thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to be here and look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you. Well done. Good stuff. Thank you. Yeah, please do. Yeah. So look, lots of questions arise from that. Thank you very much for doing that. And I've got a couple of questions I want to throw to you. But before I get into that, I really, really, really want to encourage questions from the floor. A few have come in on Pigeonhole, but we do have roving mics. And I think it would be really nice to actually hear from people. And I'm going to be totally honest about a complete bias. I would love women to put questions. If there's any women in the audience who would like to put a question on this or broader topics, Alejandro and I would be very, very keen to field them. All you've got to do is stick your hand in the air or send in a question with your name on that. While you're wondering, women out there, what you're going to ask, and whether you'd like to do that. Let me just put to you, Alejandro, whether companies who are facing these kind of challenges, in your experience, when they've seen this tool, this model, whether the reaction is, look, I know all this, were the companies experiencing the difficulties and challenges of some of these countries which you've outlined, that they know that already. Do they really need this in addition? What sort of response have you had? And if it's positive, is it because you've reframed in a more interesting and an illustrative way things they knew about but hadn't really put together before?
Yeah, but I think it's very clear that we all share an intuition. And that intuition is we need to look beyond silos, and that came up a lot of times today, I think. And so when the experience so far is people going, wow, because I know the individual components, but the fact that these things are happening at the same time has a different implication for strategic thinking. I mean, we've worked with context in Brazil of hydropower investments, where you're looking at the fact that deforestation, climate change, and land degradation are happening at the same time. When you combine that with the knowledge that 80% of electricity in Brazil is generated by dams, then you very clearly begin to see, there is going to be electricity shortages in Brazil because the forests are not able to produce a hydrological cycle, because climate change is amplifying that, and water scarcity.
We were talking about droughts and so forth.
We were talking about this in 2013, and this is what happened in Brazil 2 years later. And that was, to me, was amazing, is because in many ways, I think this acts a bit as an oracle almost, right? Where you really, it's a new way of seeing these issues. And what does that mean? It means that, if you look at the individual silos, yes, I know deforestation, I know climate change, but when you look at the system of issues, then for dams, it means investing in ecological regeneration, because that increases resilience of the flow throughput through to the dam. To all other electricity-intensive companies, it meant an understanding that Brazil, in my view, is probably going to shift to a more carbon-intensive matrix, because it doesn't have enough water to power its low-carbon electricity. And what does that mean for companies that are very carbon-intensive? Their carbon footprint is going to probably go up. And so this, I think, is just one example that illustrates what a more holistic way of thinking about these issues can do to having more foresight in terms of scenarios that are actually extremely likely.
A lot of interesting questions have come up. One of them, I guess, is political, which is that a company could have everything all worked out, and then it's experiencing political change. I mean, the question that's come up is where governments live from election to election, short cycles, and companies are going quarter to quarter. How does a company embed sustainability goals when it's trying to experience what may be either that short electoral cycle with changing governments or changing emphases, or I'm going to add something to this question: what if there's real instability? Plenty of examples, even in the last few years, of regime change of various kinds, standoffs after disputed elections.
Yes, I think there's an extreme case that has to do with political violence, and that's let's say a separate case. I would say there's two insights to reply to that question. The first is we've pushed in many of the work we've done publicly, that you can see it, you can download it from the website. We're arguing for government affairs divisions in companies to become actors of positive change. To, let's say, exercise the muscle of engaging with governments around lobbying for policies, for lobbying for these sorts of things that have to do with change. We've called that business diplomacy for sustainable development. And I think that notion of business diplomacy in many ways has captured the imagination of many people. Now then you have the question of the time cycles. And let me give you one example. There's one mining company in an African country that we looked at. One of the biggest challenges to the operational costs of extractive companies today in Africa and in some Latin American countries is local content, is the political demand to companies to hire mostly local people. And where you need jobs that are very high, so let's say highly skilled, this creates all sorts of problems, right? Because there's accidents, there's delays, there's overruns, and so on. Now, there's one case where a company has totally taken ownership of the challenge and developed, let's say, quite a sophisticated way of creating employment through its value chains and creating programs to promote SMEs and SME development, which, by the way, I think SME development is a very, very big theme for the SDGs. It has partnered the government and creating enabling environments, mobile platforms, all sorts of things that the government then took as a best practice to create a whole government fund to promote such practices. And so I think there's something that has to do with corporate entrepreneurship or corporate leadership where you actually focus on solutions that has the power to influence how governments think about government investment in some of these issues. And that's just one tactical, if you want, way to move out of a more theoretical challenge, And we need to, I think, get more practical.
Got it. Thanks for that. Now, something incredibly exciting is happening. 2 women have posted questions. Where are those roving mics? I would love to get Georgie. Where are you sitting, Georgie? Stick your hand right at the back. Can we get a mic to you? I'd love to hear you put your question to Alejandro rather than just me read it off the screen here.
Hi, thank you. Georgie at Diageo. Alejandro, a very broad question because it's a massive issue. But there's been some discussion around the role that changing agriculture has on other sustainable development goals. I want to flip that around and ask, what is the impact that gender equality could have on the agricultural industry, just from your experience?
There's one case that comes to mind that is in South Africa, where there's been a program that has tried to test exactly that. And what they found is that when cooperatives that were women-led were supported, that is farmer cooperatives, the productivity was tremendously higher. The commitment, the performance, the delivery schedules, everything increased, right? And so I think that there's it's almost like a no-brainer. Investing in women, empowering women has all sorts of systemic impacts on productivity, on cost, on profit, on reliability, and all sorts of other things. And that would be a bit of the direction of my answer.
Would you factor in the fact that in some countries that's going to be a real uphill struggle, culturally, traditionally?
Well, there's a cultural dimension. And this is where partnerships matter. There's a lot of NGOs working on these issues, on cultural change, on policy change, on changing policies that don't allow women to inherit land or to inherit assets. And I think this is where companies have a lot to gain. We were talking yesterday about companies that use their infrastructure, the distribution networks, the suppliers, it's almost like a skeleton where you can hang all sorts of services and other organizations' missions to drive that, to drive microfinance, to drive education, to drive health. And there's such an enormous win-win when companies basically use their relationships to try to bring others' missions to do exactly those sorts of things.
Got a great question here. As I said, I'm totally biased in favor of women putting questions here. Suzanne, you've got a great question, which I'd really love to hear you put. Stick your hand in the air. Suzanne,
it's
can we get a mic?
Only for women to be able to ask.
No, I said I'm totally biased. It's absolutely... It's a really good question coming now.
Yeah, I was trying to understand, I understand...
Sorry, Suzanne, could you just say where you're from?
Oh,
I mean, who you represent?
I'm the Director of Agri-Business for FMO, the Development Bank,
Okay.
Netherlands. And I find these topics extremely interesting, and I would very much like to talk to you afterwards. But I think that, I struggle with how are companies able to get this on the government's agenda without politicizing it. Politics and often turns things into a different way, a different method. So how do you effectively do that? And what I was also wondering is that maybe one way was to, some of the numbers we heard this morning. Do you quantify it? How do you quantify the cost of these to get people's attention?
Thank you. And let me just say, I think that the role of development finances is phenomenal and really cuts across all of these different things. Now, all of the examples I gave are very practical examples of companies doing stuff. And my sense is that we can cut through the complexity, and when companies are proposing models, where companies are engaging local governments with proposals, then I think things just move. There's so many cases. There's the case of Netafim, the drip irrigation company working in states like Andhra Pradesh in India, leveraging state funds, enabling more than 200,000 smallholder farmers to access and actually buy the products in a way that is subsidized by the government, with an insurance element, with insurance companies. There's so much stuff that is possible that I think just has to do with a more entrepreneurial approach of actually companies wanting to take that extra step. And this is where I think development finance has a big role to play, because it can, in many ways, create blended capital to allow many of these things to actually be viable from a commercial perspective.
Does that answer the question? Yeah, I mean, I picked up from your question a sort of unease, perhaps, about the political lobbying you suggested might be needed. Is that right?
Through examples, concrete examples, to make it forward. Because my concern is that if you have, with the political side, sometimes you lose control of the agenda, what your original intention was, and it goes completely sideways. But to make it real, I guess, is where you get the biggest impact.
Well, I mean, I think there's also another angle on this. There's a fairly uncomfortable history of major companies influencing small countries. I think of the banana republics as the classic case. I mean, can this go too far?
Well, I think what I'm saying is we need to be, I think this is a time to also be tactical. I don't think that the issue of political engagement, we're not talking of political meddling with elections. We're not talking about politicizing stuff. I think in many ways the very practical examples are all about delivering outcomes. And in cases where, this is where it really is about, in many ways, sort of tactical decisions of who is in charge of a program and partnerships between companies and governments that may have an NGO that is well reputed and has good control systems. Maybe that is the NGO that carries the management or the administration of a particular program. So I think that, I'm just not to get too much into the detail, but I think that we shouldn't shy away from proposing a greater dialogue and cooperation and engagement from the companies with governments, because this is, I think, what the next stage of sustainable development requires, is to really bridge that gap, which is also a gap in languages. I mean, we were talking about this earlier. I think for me, when I open besides the work with companies, is how much governments have embraced this as a way to create a common language because the ways and the rhythms and the speeds at which companies think and make decisions and governments think and make decisions, they're just from different planets in some cases. And you need that common denominator that really defines, okay, these are priority areas, and really creates that common language, that converging interests.
So that kind of leads us to the topic of corruption, in a way. And as a great question that's top of the ranking here, with actually only 54 countries scoring greater than 50 on the World Transparency Index, how do companies navigate in the other countries, which are LDCs, with rampant corruption, and which are also major, well, it says here, playgrounds for agri-biz? I mean, does anybody want to address that question before Alejandro responds? This idea of corruption, the difficulties of operating. Everyone's keeping a bit quiet on that one. Well, how difficult is that for companies to pick a path through that? If there's, in terms of land, maybe labor, climate, all the right ingredients for a big operation, but really serious corruption?
Well, look,
I suppose in the context of greater transparency for companies.
It's messy, and it's not unlike the challenges that any development agency that is trying to affect change is facing. Big development agencies are investing millions to change accountability practices and open budgets in governments, and face that's impossible, that maybe the money is being siphoned. It's very complicated, and I think companies are bringing an innovation in the sense that global companies have internal standards and internal practices that really cross borders. And so even in cases where you don't have international governance systems, the fact that a company with very strong ethical, normative systems is able to operate in a country and import in some, or export, or bring with a particular set of norms of behavior, I think that also may have an impact in the country. Now, of course, navigating the complexity is difficult, but I think that is bread and butter of everyday experience of any company operating in developing. Is really trying to shield oneself and work around some of these obstacles and create sort of more stable value.
So has there ever been a country where you've applied your risk model, your matrix, and then on the basis of that would advise a company not to invest in?
No, look, from
and
the
as a journalist, I want you to name that country.
Yeah, I know I saw the question.
Yeah.
Before. I want to share that from the very, very beginning of this work, I made the conscious decision that the index was not going to be a ranking of countries, right? Because that creates all sorts of just perverse and unintended consequences that have to do with decision not to invest. We're talking about transformation. Transformation is complicated. And the reason why we've opted for a visual that gives you a sense of the things that need to be navigated and transformed is exactly because of that. We're rather saying, of course, if we're dealing with a client that is asking, out of these 5 countries, what is the best country to invest in, then that's a specific question, right? But in general, the purpose of the work is to really understand what is the transformative potential and where are the areas for.
But there might be.
But the answer is no.
Okay, but there might be a country where there's some screamingly awful problem.
South Sudan.
Okay, that's a conflict zone, yeah. Really. All right. I'm thinking more of staggering human rights abuses.
Like where?
Well, we can name quite a few. But would you then advise that there shouldn't be an investment there?
I think the answer is it depends.
Okay, so there may be other factors that would.
Yes, it depends. I think I think the point is circumstances matter, context matters. This is a navigational tool that really expands the possibilities of looking at problems and solutions. And then the rest depends. It depends on a lot of different things.
Is Carla happy to voice her question? Where's Carla? Stick your hand in the air. I'd like to hear your question. Over there at the back. There we go. Thank you very much. And would you mind just saying who you represent, where you're from?
Sure. I'm Carla. I'm from the World Food Program of the United Nations.
Got it.
So my question is how to go from pilot to pilot, because you always say, in this case, in blah, blah, blah country and so on, we have these initiatives that proved to be very successful. And we have also all these cases, and I'm sure all my colleagues in other agencies do as well. But how do we move that from those small pilots to more sustainable initiatives, especially given that our metrics in my organization, the organizations where we work are very different than the metrics in the private sector, and we're measured differently. So how do we, not only in terms of cycles, but in terms of metrics, leverage these two different aspects?
So just before, there must be some overlap in metrics, isn't there? Or are they completely different?
There is some overlap, but not necessarily in these aspects of sustainable development goals.
Right.
Again, we are measured by zero hunger. That's a lofty goal, and we have to somehow build the standards within that particular goal. You are not only measured against that goal solely, but you're also measured against your shareholders. You're also measured against, I don't know, your supply chain effectiveness and other aspects of your business. That's just the reality of this.
Yeah.
But the question is about scale, and
Correct.
right. And so, what I would say is, I think the key to scale has to do with scaling infrastructures, and this is quite frankly where I think the Global Alliance is just a phenomenal innovation in the making, of course. But part of the reason why I've mentioned the examples I've mentioned is in the hope that in the initial discussions of the alliance, some of these things can begin to come up, and then there can be a broader strategic discussion of how some of these very specific success stories, that is not just a particular context specific. I really think that these are models, are archetypes of ways of engaging on building livelihoods, on working on forest governance, and so on and so forth. And this is where the alliance has an enormous potential, and other similar structures where you really have a lot of critical mass to build those partnerships that can help, perhaps you and your particular projects to then take them on a bigger scale. Ultimately, scale, I think, is not so much about going from one pilot project to 10,000. Scale is really when you get the governance systems to change the norms, right? And I think one example of this is the EITI, is the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. Fascinating experiment in many ways. Previous generation of multi-stakeholder initiatives try to increase the transparency of revenues from extractive industries in very difficult developing countries with very difficult governance contexts. Totally uphill. But then the World Bank, at some point, made the decision to make the EITI part of the conditionality on lending to countries. And you can see the logic of a scaling infrastructure where an idea is taken up as part of a broader infrastructure. And so this is, again, where development finance and multilateral banks, central banks, central governments have a very important role to play. But we can only start to plan these partnerships of scaling partnerships once we can start working through platforms like the Alliance and other collaborative bodies.
Thank you very much. Now, having said I'm only going to take questions from women, I'm going to just break my own rule here, because Robert Tomlin has a really, really interesting point. Robert, do you want to raise your hand and then you can put it directly to Alejandro?
Well, as Sunny knows, I'm a former director of Olam. I think you accused me of being the director who asked most questions. It struck us that when you gave the very interesting example of how a harvest failure in one country led to a major political crisis in another, that the models that you gave us, other than the specific Brazilian one, which the Brazil-Paraguay one, how can you make that the individual country analysis work so we can find the stress points that exist between a problem in the one and the problem in the other?
Thank you.
I'm glad you asked the question. I had more examples that I took out because I wanted to make the presentation somewhat compact and very practical. But I'll answer very specifically. We've built into the index 3 wedges that are there, that are the import dependence of that country from other trading partners. So you have, I don't know if you saw it, but you have food import dependence, you have energy import dependence, and you have virtual water imports, right? And we have the data sets for all of that. And we have data for all the countries in the world, right? So what we've done in the past, and I'm happy to share this work, it's all, that is also publicly available on the web, where we've applied the index in an interconnected way. And so with Olam last year, in the index last year, we did one such study of India and Nigeria and the interconnection around rice. And that is, you can read that, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But the point is that with the device of the index, we can also apply that at a geopolitical level. Because once we understand imagine is one country, from there you can trace out, let's say, who are the top 5 suppliers of energy, of food for particular commodities, and of virtual water, which correlates very much with agricultural commodities, right? Because most of the water that countries import virtually is the one that is embedded in the irrigated crop. But it just opens a totally different layer of analysis that is embedded in how we've constructed the model, is to really begin to look at the geopolitical aspects of some of these things.
So it works internationally as well as nationally?
It works internationally, and some of the things that we are exploring through our work has to do, and this is again the notion of business diplomacy. We've begun to engage global companies with this analysis, and there's a lot of interest from ministries of foreign affairs that are very engaged in commercial diplomacy, because obviously embassies are trying to promote the interest of national companies, and this provides a totally new sort of playing field of information to be very strategic in terms of which are the countries with whom we are engaging in commercial diplomacy and how that benefits the companies that are headquartered or that operate under our flag. So that's a whole other level that I left out just to keep the conversation, somewhat.
Alejandro, thank you very much for that. Thank you for the questions. Sorry to all the men who asked questions who didn't get the chance to air them. But I think after this morning and the discussions around the gender issue there, I was very, very keen to hear some female voices. And we've got to wrap it now. I think that's been a really fascinating insight into a way of thinking, breaking down the silos which normally govern how we explore these issues and bringing it all together in that very visual way. Would you all join me in thanking Alejandro? Well done. Good stuff. Thank you very much. Well done. Good stuff.